From Washington, D.C., the swamp itself, this is the week's worst with Allen and Vadum.
I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen, Vice President and Chief Investigative Officer of the Capital Research Center.
And I'm Matthew Vadum, Senior Vice President at Capital Research Center and Editor-in-Chief of BombThrowers.com.
And I'm Jake Klein, Media Producer at the Capital Research Center, and I'll be moderating this podcast in which we dig through the news for stories that we think are the most outrageous, the most ridiculous, the worst. So today we'll be discussing Trump's foreign policy in a number of ways as it relates to our current military actions. We discussed the situation in Syria briefly last week, just after it happened, but to refresh, after a deadly sarin gas attack that killed numerous civilians, President Trump ordered a Tomahawk missile strike against Syrian military targets. As of now, it seems to have been a limited strike, but escalation is still possible, and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has told his Russian counterpart that Assad must go. Assad and Russian media have denied responsibility for the attack, but their denials are not seen as credible by our intelligence. In Afghanistan, we used the, quote, mother of all bombs for the first time, formerly known as the GBU-43/B Massive Ordnance Air Blast. It successfully destroyed an ISIS tunnel complex without civilian casualties. Most recently, President Trump has deployed a Navy strike force to the Korean Peninsula in preparation of North Korea's, quote, big surprise Saturday, which is rumored to be a nuclear weapons test. Reports have surfaced that Trump is considering a preemptive strike if they move forward with that. Now, North Korea has escalated the saber-rattling by saying they would not hesitate to use a nuclear bomb as a preemptive strike against American forces preparing a military attack on the country. So we're dealing with three separate, loosely connected topics in this episode. So why don't we quickly lay out our positions on the Syria situation, the MOAB use, and the North Korean saber rattling before getting into the details.
Well, one of the things that I see in looking at this is the ghost of James Buchanan and the ghost of Stanley Baldwin. James Buchanan was the U.S. president who didn't prevent the Civil War, was someone who could have done something, and he's considered, I think, the worst U.S. president because of his not doing the things that were necessary to prevent one of the great catastrophes in the history of this country, of getting rid of slavery without killing the massive numbers of people that were killed in the Civil War. And I think 750,000, something like that. And Stanley Baldwin was the British prime minister 3 times and very popular. He left office because he had been the person who stood for peace with the countries of the world as the fascist powers were rising, and he had peace conferences and said that we're never going to go to war again. That World War we now call it World War I. That World War was so terrible that we're never going to do that again, and everybody was happy with that. So now you have a situation where Barack Obama and his secretaries of state, Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, created a situation where they just left these things on the table. They didn't do anything to stop us from getting to the point where we are now. In fact, worse, for example, in Syria, they waited until the potentially pro-U.S. faction was eliminated so that we were left with a choice between the one side, Assad, backed by Russia and Iran, and on the other side, ISIS. And that puts us in a real mess. And that kind of thing is duplicated in various places around the world. So this is their gift to you, President Trump.
That's right. And the situation is getting messier and stickier by the day. What we're reflecting on most recently has happened this week was this MOAB, the Massive Ordnance Air Bomb. It's such an awesome acronym. Mother of all bombs is much better. And it was dropped on a target on caves, apparently, in Afghanistan, going after ISIS-KP, or ISIS Khorasan province, the local affiliate that carries out that is franchised by ISIS to serve up their dishes of
kind of like McDonald's.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that caused a tremendous explosion of 11 tons or so of TNT that would have smashed the tunnel complex, the headquarters that ISIS was using there in eastern Afghanistan. And there was some local criticism of it. Hamid Karzai, former president of Afghanistan, or as some like to mock him, his presidency was more like being mayor of Kabul because it was an ineffective state. There has been some local blowback, and he criticized the Americans for using Afghanistan basically as a testing ground for their new awful weapons. And so there's been some criticism of it, but actually not a lot of criticism of it. Barbara Lee, the far-left congresswoman from Berkeley, California, also was very upset that this bomb was dropped on Afghanistan. And it's interesting that even when, after September 11th, when Afghanistan was targeted, even left-wing pacifistic Democrats like Howard Dean were totally on board with the war in Afghanistan. It's only now that a lot of them are getting cold feet.
Well, and you have this weird situation where Tulsi Gabbard, who's the member of Congress from Hawaii, who's a Democrat who supported Bernie Sanders in the presidential race, and is raising questions about the attribution of the attack that led to all this, the chemical weapons attack. And she's being denounced by Howard Dean, who was, of course, the anti-war candidate in 2004. And she's being denounced by the woman who runs the Center for American Progress, which is essentially an arm of the Hillary Clinton.
Neera Tanden is the president.
Neera, exactly. And they're saying that she doesn't have any business in Congress. She should be voted out by her constituents. That she's a disgrace for raising questions about the attribution of this attack. And, I'm one of these people, I tend to be supportive, particularly when you have people from both parties and all the different factions who have access to the intelligence reports. And when they say that it's really the Assad regime, I tend to at least think that they may be correct. But on the other hand, it does seem to make little sense that Assad would be winning the war and then do the one thing that could get him wiped out, which is to violate the prohibition on chemical weapons that's been in effect for many decades, technically going back to 1925. Why would he do this? So there are legitimate questions. There are a lot of technical things that have been raised in various blogs and websites on the right and the left. Looking at analyzing videos and trying to find some clues. There is no question, I think, that there was a chemical weapons attack. The problem is the attribution, who was responsible for it. And so she's asked for evidence, which seems to me a reasonable thing to do. Members of Congress should be provided a certain amount of information to make their decisions. How can they make their decisions otherwise? And there's this savage response to, oh my gosh, she's this horrible person, this monster, by people on the left. So you have all these people who used to be peaceniks who suddenly they're the war party. Very, very strange environment that we're in.
Let me push you on that a little bit, but first, just let me lay out my position really quickly on these, because I'm a libertarian and we might have some pushback, especially between me and Matthew, which could be interesting to dive deeper in. This Moab use, we've been doing these sorts of strikes for a long time. This is a bigger weapon. Personally, I don't feel like that's that big a deal. I think we've said everything particularly meaningful worth saying about that. But this,
I would say this. I would say this. This is really nothing new other than just the size of it. I mean, it's very spectacular when you see the mushroom cloud. But we actually have a bigger weapon instead of the massive ordnance airburst weapon. It's the massive ordnance penetrator, and it's actually bigger than this. The Russians reportedly have something 4 times as big, which is basically a fire-based weapon, a hyperbaric weapon.
Little Tsar or something.
Yeah. And of course, what this weapon did was it creates a massive pressure front, which can kill people in tunnels and collapse the tunnels and disable a tunnel network, and that's the reason that they were intent on using it here. But this is not any. USA Today had a hilarious chart where they compared it to the little boy, which was dropped on Hiroshima, and they were off by a factor of 1,000 in their calculation, claiming that this was almost the size of a nuclear weapon. And no, they were off by a factor of 1,000. It's about 1,300 times the bomb, or 1/1300th of the size of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. So the idea that this is some sort of crossing this line in the future, in the history of warfare, or anything like that's just not true.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't necessarily think this is good, but it's nothing new. Regarding Syria and North Korea, this is something that I find really concerning, the possibility of escalating conflicts in these regions without it being clear, to me at least, what the tangible benefit to the United States national security is. This doesn't seem to me in concert with Trump's America First policy. But Steve, going back to what you said a little bit earlier about, you seem to kind of agree with the line that Syria and Russia are putting out about, wouldn't have made sense for Assad to initiate this strike. And there was a chemical weapons attack, but do we actually know it was from him? But don't you think we must have learned our lesson after Iraq? Or is our intelligence and military so stupid that we could make this mistake again?
Well, the thing that people have to realize is that once you announce you have an intelligence service, then people start to penetrate it. And so you have bad guys. That happened during the Cold War. You had Soviet agents who came in and they were manipulating intelligence reports to benefit them. Sometimes it was ideological. It was just that you had people who went to Yale and studied economics in Yale. And because they studied economics at Yale, they didn't understand how economics worked. And so they would predict, for example, that the Soviet Union would have 4 times the, or would have a bigger industrial economy than the U.S. by the 1990s, 4 times the rate of economic growth of the U.S. Totally ridiculous. Of course, the Soviet Union didn't even exist into the 1990s very far. So this is a common thing. There was a Cuban agent who penetrated the intelligence services and was providing a lot of false information that our decision makers relied on. She's now serving, I think, a 25-year prison sentence once it was determined that she was a Cuban agent, but it had a lot of lasting impacts. So what you get is you get a mixture of people who are wrong and they're under pressure to say yes or no whether something is true when they just don't have enough information. They make the best guess they can. And then in a few cases, you've got people who either have an ideological agenda, a political agenda, or sometimes, in a few rare cases, but sometimes strategically important cases, they're actually working for the other side. So I'm always very skeptical of intelligence reports. It doesn't mean I think that the Russians are telling the truth or Assad is telling the truth. It just means that I think that members of Congress should, as appropriate, be given the information that who are skeptics, and skeptics should be treated with respect, as long as they're reasonable. They're not making up grand conspiracies. They just want to see the evidence that this was actually Assad that was behind this before we proceed based on that assumption into what could be a larger war with, Russia.
Matthew, Donald Trump ran on the notion that to successfully fight ISIS, we need to back off on aggression against the Assad regime. Has anything changed? Why, this is such a reversal of his campaign position?
I'm not trying to be evasive here. I'm not sure that he exactly said that. Donald Trump has no real cohesive philosophy of the world. A lot of the time he comes down on the conservative side, which makes us conservatives really happy. But to say that he has that kind of a foreign policy vision, I'm not sure that that's accurate. I know that he and a lot of his so-called alt-right backers, like Mike Chernovich and so on, were very keen on not going to war with Syria. And I guess that Trump thought that we needed to focus our efforts on fighting ISIS, Islamic State. I don't know if he had ever expressed any sort of a philosophical objection to attacking Syria. I thought it was more, and I could be mistaken, I thought it was more of a practical objection in that it's this huge can of worms and that everybody is evil on all sides. And there's no strategic interest of the United States served. So having muddied the water there sufficiently to cover my posterior, let me say that it's entirely possible that Donald Trump was so moved by reels, footage of little kids suffering in Syria from gas poisoning to suddenly want to do something. Any other president, I would question it, but with Donald Trump, and his shall we say flexibility. With him, I'm guessing he's telling the truth. I'm not sure how much of a shift it is. There's also the element here that a message needed to be sent about the use of weapons of mass destruction, and the VX gas or sarin gas or whatever it was that was used in sarin was is banned under international conventions of war. So, there are many reasons why Trump may have attacked Syria, but whether that's going to lead to a long-term engagement there, your guess is as good as mine. Sorry, I couldn't be any clearer, but it is a fairly murky area.
Well, I think that Donald Trump, maybe he doesn't have what some people would consider a coherent philosophy, but most politicians don't. The ones that you hear expressing an ideological point of view, particularly conservatives, well, I happen to know most of them don't really have that consistent point of view. That's just something they say to get elected. And Donald Trump, the difference was he was sort of out there. He was saying what he really believed, and that stood him in good stead. That's a lot of people voted for him simply because, here's somebody who will tell me the truth, even if I don't agree with him. He'll be honest about what he believes or doesn't believe. And he was clear during the campaign that this was what's called an America First or a non-interventionist foreign policy, that was generally speaking what he was pursuing, while at the same time saying that we should go after the major threats like ISIS and the Islamofascist terrorists who attacked us on 9/11 in the case of Al-Qaeda. So I don't know that it's fair. I guess it's true he doesn't have a coherent philosophy. It's not really fair to suggest that that's anything unusual. Now, it does get him into a mess, what you have now, because you do have the hardcore people who supported Trump based on foreign policy. I was certainly attracted to that point of view. People like Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson, who has a forum every night at 9 o'clock Eastern time on Fox, and has been expressing his concerns about what seems to be a shift, and concern that sort of the generals have come in, or it's the return of the neocons, which is their term for the people who got us into the Iraq War. So Trump is, I think, trying to navigate the area between not responding to the chemical attack, if in fact it was Assad, because you have to do that if it was Assad, because of the violation of the international order on weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear weapons. You have to stop those from spreading. You can't let those get loose, in my opinion. And so you have to enforce those norms. If people use them, you have to come down really hard in a way you wouldn't otherwise if they were just killing people with bullets or regular bombs. So, but I think he's trying to navigate that. So you've had this sort of the pulling back. We don't want to expand this into a larger war. Of course, then there are reports today of the plans for sending in lots of troops, U.S. troops. That, I think, would be a disaster. And this all goes back to why they went after Trump on the Russia thing. Why did you have this massive, hilarious now hoax that Trump was somehow a spy for the Russians because he was being blackmailed because of what happened in a hotel room at the Ritz-Carlton in Moscow? Totally ridiculous. And yet this seems to be the basis for most of the Democratic Party's opposition to Trump, the way, at least in terms of how much effort they spend on it. Well, it's because he suggested a grand bargain with Moscow. That is to say, we would ease up a little bit on Putin, and in return, Putin would help us crush the Islamofascists, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on. And maybe we would have more peace. We would have détente. The liberals loved it when it was called détente with the Soviet Union, but then making peace with Russia, or at least having less tension, though that's horrible, because Putin's a monster, and which he is, by the way. But sometimes you have to make very hardcore realpolitik decisions, the realistic politics. And that was what Trump offered. And of course, that's been sort of shattered now. And people wonder, is this connected to all the accusations about Russia? And is there pressure to sort of prove that you can stand up to Putin? And is that pushing Trump in a particular direction? I think it has had an impact. It's gotten rid of some of the more non-interventionist people in terms of the foreign policy process. It's removed them. So when you have Steve Bannon not on the National Security Council, that's concerning that you would not have that voice or that person who was in on the discussions. And you just hope that people who have more realistic views are among those who would replace him in that position.
Well, let's dive into that a little bit further. I mean, where is the line between interventionism and non-interventionism where, we should fall? What my view would be, the role of the American military is to protect American citizens in America. I'm deeply, deeply, deeply concerned about chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. But whether it's Syria or the rebels or whoever was using it, they're not going to use it over here. North Korea doesn't have ICBMs yet to get a nuclear weapon to us. Where is the line in terms of these conflicts, especially about when we should be getting involved?
Matthew, what do you think? You're a person of Canadian origin, so as a Canadiarian or a Canadianese or whatever they call people like yourself,
downtown Canadian,
something like that,
right?
What's your perspective on this?
Well, the Canadians' perspective would be the wimpy perspective. They'd say, "Let the United Nations decide, and then we'll convene a panel, a parliamentary commission to look at this." But that's not my perspective, which might explain why I'm not in Canada anymore. In any event, deeply concerning this all is. What was the question again? What is the line between?
What is the line? At what point, no matter how scary something going on in the world is, does America get involved?
America gets involved, I guess, when her people are moved deeply. You had the situation, once we started to learn about the horrors of ISIS, of Islamic State, and what they were actually doing to people, even Rand Paul, the famously libertarian Republican senator from Kentucky, said that, that the Islamic State, that these people are barbarians and they need to be exterminated. So it's a question of, it's not just a question of principle, it's a question of degree. And when Islamic supremacists like Islamic State take Christians and Yazidis and put them in cages and drown them on camera, immerse them in swimming pools, for dramatic effect, so you can watch all of their death twitches, and then or tie them upside down on monkey bars and then douse them in gasoline and then have a trail of flame lead up to them, so you can watch them grimacing in their final moments on Earth, dying terrible deaths, and picking out these people just because they have the wrong beliefs. That is powerful, and that is frightening to the American people. And so, in effect, the Islamic State propaganda, the videos that they put together, these horrible snuff films, basically featuring Christians and Muslims, fellow Muslims that weren't extreme enough, who they also consider to be heretics and infidels and apostates and so on. That sort of thing really can drive the message home, and their propaganda intended to recruit fellow crazies to their cause has backfired largely, and awakened the world to how horrifying these people really are. So I don't think, again, it's a matter of principle. I think it's a matter of degree and presentation. And what the evidence we've seen about Islamic State is really gut-wrenching, and people respond at a visceral level. Like we have to wipe these people out. They have to be eradicated from the earth. And what used to sound like 5 years ago like a crazy fanatical position now is just common sense.
Well, I think that my standard is not what we see on video, and I know that sounds cold-hearted, but there are horrible conflicts going on all around the world. There are ethnic groups that are being exterminated even as we speak. We have to be very careful about sticking our nose in lots of places just because we've seen that it backfires. The whole point of the ISIS and the other Islamofascists is that they believe in Sharia law. They believe in a worldwide state that is governed by Muslim law.
Caliphate.
A caliphate. And so that means that they're after us. And they really are. Now, does that mean that we're the immediate target? Not necessarily. It may be that they can be managed that in some way, that we can pit them against each other, as we had for many years. We had a nice situation where Iran and Iraq were fighting each other and essentially neutralizing each other because they were occupied with each other. So can we achieve something like that so that we don't have to intervene? Maybe so. But my principle is, if somebody's not coming after me, I'm very skeptical about, and by me, I mean our country, I'm very skeptical about us getting involved in military conflicts. We need to concentrate on the folks who are direct threats to us, and then try to manage our way around all the many indirect or long-term threats.
Now, I think we also have to take into account, Syria's Assad and North Korea. Don't you agree, Steve, that North Korea has been threatening us? We're still officially in a state of war with North Korea. There was no peace treaty. There was sort of a temporary armistice, a ceasefire that has been in effect since 1955, 53, something like that. So we could just resume operations against them without notice for any reason at all, and it wouldn't be a war crime. It wouldn't be against international legal norms. But do you think what North Korea is doing is so far beyond the pale that people support overthrowing that regime? For example?
I think that we have to do something about North Korea, because North Korea is openly threatening the United States, openly threatening South Korea, the West in general, and basically they've taken over this the crazy man mode, where you never know what they're going to do because they're so crazy, and that's the persona that they've created.
Well, they are pretty crazy,
and in fact, yeah, they're kind of crazy. If you see how they govern their country, they're among the worst that have ever lived in terms of a horrific dictatorship. So you do have to worry about North Korea. But remember, the key to North Korea is China. I mean, China could cut off the food in North Korea. They could, and I'm sure they have. We joke about probably half of the bodyguards of the dictator of North Korea are probably on the Chinese payroll. So any moment they could give the signal and he'd be taken out. And I say that in a joking way, but I'm not sure that's that much of a joke. I think that they exist at the sufferance of the Chinese. They are the agents, in my view, of the Chinese, because the Chinese can always hold them over us and say, if you do anything about all the terrible things that we in China do, well, then we'll just we'll let North Korea go, and they'll do whatever they want to do in terms of nukes, and they have nukes. They could get one into New York Harbor. It doesn't have to be something on a missile, but of course they're getting closer to us being able to attack us in terms of missiles as well. But I don't think that's realistic. I think it's just that one atomic bomb in New York would be, or Washington would be enough to kind of send a signal. So we've got to stop them before something crazy like that happens, before they get out of the control of China, and we've got to stop them because they're China's puppet in between.
Well, if indeed they are a puppet of China, by going to war with them, wouldn't we be risking a war with China? And also, it seems like tensions from both this North Korea situation and the Syria situation, have gone through the roof with Russia, could potentially spark a new Cold War. Shouldn't we be really, really concerned about that? And isn't that potentially reason enough to strategically back away?
Well, that was the idea of having the grand bargain with Russia, which the elites in the U.S. Reacted to savagely, to the point of trying to claim that Trump is Russia's puppet and all that.
That's right. The suddenly anti-Russian left.
Right. And remember, Barack Obama was the most pro-Russian president we've ever had. I mean, this is everything from the reset to the policy on missile defense in Europe, down to him saying to Dmitry Medvedev, Putin's sidekick, that, have Vladimir work with me, through this election, and then after the election, I'll be more flexible and I can do more things. And you can go back and look at the transcript. I'm not mischaracterizing what he said. So now they're anti-Russia, but we're the skill that's needed, unfortunately, right now, and I don't know that we have people in position to do this. The skill is you've got to somehow ratchet this down, get us to the point where our conflict with Russia and China and Iran, which is sort of forming like I could say, in sort of an axis, that conflict is managed, that it doesn't rise to the level of actual armed conflict. And what kind of deal, what kind of deal can you cut? And if there's anything that Trump is supposed to be good at, it's making deals. And we noticed this past week, he suddenly ratcheted back all the things, the terrible things he was saying about China. Well, maybe that's a good sign. Maybe that's a sign that I don't think he's changed what he thinks of China. I think he's saying the things now.
He just has a good sense of forbearance there, and he'll deal with that another time because North Korea is a more pressing issue at the moment.
Right. And if he goes to the Chinese and says, look, you've seen what I can do with this mother of all bombs. You've seen that, I can take decisive action if I have to. You don't want that to happen with North Korea. Nobody wants a big, another Korean war. And certainly we don't want to get into a war between the U.S. and China. You communists in China, you figured out a way to use what I would consider slave labor, but to use your to get rich and make your kids into billionaires. You've got a nice, comfortable lifestyle. You don't want to risk that. So maybe we can come to the table and work out some way to get rid of this mess in North Korea, because one way or the other, we're going to get rid of it. So, it's to your advantage to do this in a peaceable way and use the power that you have over North Korea to eliminate that problem.
Well, I hope it works out that way.
Fingers crossed.
Let's get into some of these specifics about the North Korea situation before we end, because with the way the saber rattling is going, and this is going to happen tomorrow. I don't know when you're listening, but we're recording this on Friday, April 14th. Tomorrow will be Saturday, April 15th. That is this big Saturday surprise from North Korea. We are considering this preemptive strike. They have said if they get a serious sign that we're going to do that, they're willing to preemptively use a nuclear weapon. Obviously, nobody wants North Korea to have nuclear weapons, but how is risking the first nuclear war since World War II in our nation's interest?
Well, if there's one thing we've learned from history, it's that the people who say in advance we're not going to go to war no matter what, that those are the ones who end up getting us into war. And you've got to stand up to a bully. You can't let someone do what North Korea is doing, threatening the West with nuclear weapons. You can't let them do it and not have there be consequences. And I know it's painful. It's frightening that you have to threaten war in order to make sure that war doesn't happen. But the people who are whether it's leading up to the Civil War, whether it's leading up to World War II, all those who were most consumed with preventing war, they're the ones that took us down the path that led to war. So I'm as scared. I live in Washington, D.C. I live a few blocks, and my office is a few blocks from what would be ground zero if Washington were to be attacked, according to the emergency management people and all their little disaster drills that they do and so on. So
you'd get vaporized. Steve.
I would get vaporized.
That would be a pretty radical diet.
Yeah, I know. So and that occurs to me occasionally, and
I wouldn't mind getting partially vaporized.
Yeah, well, I think you get vaporized on Saturday night sometimes, I hear, but that you have to do. You have to be realistic about this, and that means that we're going to have some belligerent rhetoric on both sides before this thing is resolved. Let's just hope that cooler heads prevail.
Steve, you're also an expert in biodefense, so I wanted to talk to you about that as well. Earlier this year, we learned North Korea has VX from when they assassinated Kim Jong-nam in Malaysia, which is the most deadly nerve agent in existence. I've read if it were deployed in Seoul, it would leave it uninhabitable for months and potentially kill most of the population. South Korea also believes North Korea has many other types of chemical weapons and biological weapons, including smallpox and plague. What can you tell us about North Korea's chemical and biological weapons program and what it might mean if we go to war?
Well, chemical weapons are mainly terror weapons. Their use is very limited. You've got blowback. You use it, and then the wind changes direction. You end up hurting your own troops. You can't go into an area if you're doing fast warfare, trying to conquer territory. You can't use it. That's one of the reasons the Nazis didn't use chemical weapons in World War II. Which they didn't on the battlefield. That's how it's you determine whether someone uses chemical weapons. You use that terminology. But the fact is that I'm not really concerned about VX. I mean, they used VX in the assassination. Somebody said they were trying to send a signal send a message that they had VX, this gas. That goes back, to for decades. That has been sort of standard in the arsenal of the major powers. But so they had a Tupperware container full of VX because that's all you need to smear on somebody's face to kill them with it. VX is basically the consistency of motor oil. You send it out in some device that explodes, and you have droplets of it covering people. And in a small area, it can be very effective. I'm not concerned about anything involving chemical weapons at all regarding North Korea. They could have an attack on across the border, and they would kill people. But as a weapon, as a major weapon of war, significant impact, probably not. Biological weapons are more dangerous, but they're limited. There are only certain ones that are very effective as right now with the technology that we have. A lot of that comes from the Russian effort the Russians had the largest covert scientific program in the history of the world to develop biological weapons during the Cold War. The Chinese carried on a lot of research. Anything the North Koreans would have would most likely be technology from the Chinese, and I can't see them use. I mean, whether they use anthrax, they're going to use plague. There are certain weapons that you could have smallpox, for example, as a weapon, but you would want to have a massive program to vaccinate your own people. The North Koreans wouldn't be able to do anything like that. So essentially, I'm not worried about right now. I'm worried about a few nukes. And not a large number of nukes, but a few nukes that the North Koreans have, and I'm worried about any kind of conventional attacks, terrorist attacks across the border. Mainly, you just the concern that I have in North Korea is a catastrophic attack, such as nuking New York City, and that's something that you have to. And that would be like on a ship.
Let's keep in mind they can't reach New York City. They don't have ICBMs yet.
No, I said that. That's what I said. On a ship, in the cargo hold of a ship, and not by a missile. That's down the road, and we need to take care of it now while we still can.
Do we know if they have nuclear subs?
Submarines?
Yeah.
No. I don't. I mean, their resources are relatively limited. It's just that they're very belligerent. You know, the example.
Well, they have, and relatively speaking, they have a huge army.
Right. But the example that I use is which is more dangerous, an MS-13 member with a machete or a nun with a machine gun? And the answer is it's the MS-13 member with the machete, because you've got to have the willingness to use it. You've got to have the savagery in your heart to do that kind of thing in order to, and that's what determines how dangerous you are, not necessarily how, what your overall, and they do have a huge army, and which is a big threat to South Korea.
Not the overall impressiveness of your ordnance and munitions.
Right, and they can move on South Korea. What would we do if they move on South Korea? Obviously, we have to defend South Korea. It's one of our major allies. It's one of the, sort of relatively speaking, beacons of freedom in the world, and certainly in that region. And that would be an attack on our interests directly. We have that alliance.
Well, and as I stated earlier, we're still technically in a state of war with North Korea.
Right. So
never ended. So,
yeah. So
we're in the game whether we want to be or not.
Exactly.
All right, that's our show for this week. We'll be back next week, and we hope you'll join us. If you're not already, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, and follow us on social media at Capital Research Center on Facebook and YouTube, and at Capital Research on Twitter. Steve, I think you have something to say.
I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen.
And I'm Matthew Vadum.
And I'm Jake Klein. Thanks for listening.